This is the third of a series of updates about COVID that the UK Community Advisory Board, UCAB, is doing in collaboration with BHIVA and HIV iBase. In this one, we're looking specifically at vaccines because there has been so much discussion. There is a growing body of information. And today we'll be getting questions from Jose Mejia from Metro Charity and Juddy Otti from African Advocacy and Dr. Laura Waters, chair of the British HIV Association, will be giving us some of the answers. And this is Jose Mejia, who actually himself participated in one of the vaccine trials. And Jose works for the charity Metro. Jose, would you like to just tell us a little bit about what you do with Metro? Then maybe we could go on to your experience with the vaccines.
Great. Hi, Joe. Thank you for having me. So yeah, I'm the HIV peer support manager at Metro. So I sort of oversee a lot of our peer support work, whether that's groups or one-to-one work. That's my main role there.
Okay. With the vaccine, which vaccine trial were you on and where was it?
So it's the Oxford and AstraZeneca vaccine trial, and I was sort of enrolled through the trial at St. Mary's Hospital. And this happened back in November. So I got the 2 doses of the vaccine already, one of them in mid-November, then the other one in mid-December. And yeah, in the middle of all of that, a little bit of like follow-up visits to the clinic to get some bloods and then some swabs at home, some tests at home with 2 swabs every week.
Could I just be really clear about that? Because I haven't taken part in a vaccine trial. So you had 1 dose of vaccine the end of November, yeah? Then another one mid-December. And then you had blood tests and also swabs, which you had to do yourself at home and return. Is that right?
Yeah, you just bring it to the closest like post, the closest post box, and then you'll get the results via email or via text message, and yeah.
Okay, and that was with the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine?
Yeah.
Okay, now it was at St. Mary's and it was also, I think, at Guy's and St. Thomas's, that particular trial. And you, as someone living with HIV, were you the only person involved living with HIV?
No, not really. My understanding is that each site recruited 30 people living with, or 60 people living with HIV, which means there is a pool of 120 people living with HIV as part of the Oxford and AstraZeneca vaccine trial. So yeah, as you were saying, some of us in St. Mary's, some others at Guy's. So that's kind of like the process, and it was or it is a non-blinded subgroup of the trial, so everyone got the vaccine. There were no placebos. We all got the vaccine, and yeah.
In other words, basically, they deliberately set out to recruit people for the trial who were living with HIV, because there are a lot of people, as you probably know from your own experience with the people that you work with, who don't believe that anybody with HIV has taken part in trials. And what you're telling us is that certainly in the trials you were involved in, there were 120 people living with HIV. That's right?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. Once they've done sort of the general population, what they do is they move into some subgroups with people who have different conditions, and one of them in this particular trial was HIV.
How did it affect you? Did you notice anything on having the vaccine? What happened?
Yeah, I mean, very little. I managed to cycle back from St. Mary's to South London. I carry on working that same day. So the side effects are very mild. I have a sort of very mild headache, very mild like dizziness, and that was pretty much it. At times I feel nauseous, but very mild. I literally carry on my day, and they were all gone the next day. I was just feeling as if nothing happened the next day. The other sort of thing that they looked at is the possibility of like a reaction where the jab is. I didn't have anything. There were no marks whatsoever. They're all gone. My arms look exactly just the same.
So your arms were unblemished, and you basically just had very mild side effects for a few hours immediately after you'd had the vaccination. But as you said, you were able to cycle back and you also carried on working that day. That's also going to be important for people to hear, because if you've not had the vaccine, you don't know how it might affect you. Are people that you work with concerned about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a mix of like interest and concerns. There is some hesitancy. There is curiosity as well. So in that process, I think particularly in some people living with HIV, there is this sort of wariness about being the first ones to get the vaccine because of past experiences with HIV drugs. So what they're saying or what I hear is maybe I'll wait a little bit, see how it goes with some people, and then I'll take the vaccine. Now that I'm sort of sharing my experience and saying like I've got the vaccine, this is what happened to me or what didn't happen to me, then there's more of like, okay, so what's the effectiveness of it? And that's kind of the curiosity, how effective it is, how protected we are, how, yeah, especially particularly how effective it is for people living with HIV rather than the general population.
It's much easier to take information from someone else living with HIV sometimes than from a doctor, because you maybe have the thought, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? Having said that, I'm hoping that Dr. Laura Waters, the chair of the British HIV Association, is going to be able to join us now so she can give us her views. Laura, thanks very much for joining us this morning. Could you please let us know what the vaccines actually do to people with HIV? In other words, do they support people with HIV? Do they work? Are they effective? Are there things to worry about?
So, thank you, Joe. That's a long question, so might have a slightly long answer. I apologise. So, what do the vaccines do? Well, firstly, what do vaccines do anyway? Vaccines use bits of an infection to trigger an immune response to that infection without getting the infection. So if you get anything, a common cold, measles, HIV, you develop antibodies. That's your immune system's response to that infection. And what vaccines do is they trigger the same immune response, but using little bits of the virus or the bacteria to trigger the immune response rather than a full infection. So that's how they work. Now, for people with HIV, the answer really is we don't know. So the numbers of people with HIV included in the trials has been small. So if we look, for example, at the Pfizer vaccine, and that's a vaccine that's being rolled out in the UK, the Oxford vaccine has started more recently. The Pfizer vaccine, the main study included just under 200 people with HIV compared to more than 40,000 in the whole study. And we haven't yet seen the results specifically for people with HIV. So we have to make some assumptions, but we can learn a lot from other vaccines that we use, looking at how safe those vaccines are and looking at how effective they are in people with HIV compared to people without. And really, there are two things. Is the vaccine going to be safe? And the answer is yes, we are confident it is. The only vaccines that may be an issue for some people with HIV are vaccines that are live. So actually use sort of live, weakened, but live part of the virus or live virus to stimulate an immune response. And live vaccines, if your immune system isn't working very well, can trigger a full-blown infection. None of these vaccines is live. So that's the first thing. There are no live COVID vaccines available at the moment, so that is not a concern. So that then moves us on to whether they're effective or not. Now, we know that for some vaccines, the response from people with HIV can be a bit less robust, so not as strong, may not last as long. Examples there are hepatitis B, which is why we check immunity levels more often in people with HIV, because the immunity can disappear over time. But there's no evidence that's the case for COVID. We will learn more. It's possible in the future that some people, and that may be people with HIV, it may be older people, that some people will need a booster in the future because the immunity doesn't last as long. But we're confident that the vaccine will still be protective. People should still have the vaccine. And as we learn more from these trials, we can adapt our advice going forwards.
Okay, so Jose, as you were saying, you were one of 120 people in the particular trial for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. And as far as the tests following up on that are concerned, you're producing antibodies. That's what you've been told.
Yes.
All right.
Yes. And I haven't catched the virus. Well, I haven't been out that much, but yeah, I haven't catched the virus in any circumstances.
So you're our guinea pig for the day, in as much as you've done that and
Exactly.
you're fine and everything is fine. Okay. Now, you also said to me, if I remember rightly, that there were some people that you'd spoken to who were concerned they would catch the virus from the vaccine. Is that right? Tell me about that.
Yeah, I think some people like the first thought is like, what if I get that thing, as partly because of past experiences with the flu jab. So people getting a flu after the flu jab, then people have this idea you might get COVID after getting the vaccine. But I think as Laura is saying, like, the vaccines aren't live. You're not getting COVID from the vaccine. You might catch COVID as the process of the vaccine happens, but you're not getting it from the vaccine. The vaccines are other kind of vaccines. They're mRNA and adenovirus vaccines. So I think that's sort of important to clarify. But yeah, it is a concern for people because of that experience with flu jabs.
So basically, Laura, could you just confirm it is impossible to get COVID from the vaccines because there isn't a COVID virus in the vaccines, in simple terms?
Absolutely, Joe. There is no live COVID in the COVID vaccine. You cannot get COVID from the vaccine. There's been some confusion, I think, because the Oxford vaccine, as Jose just mentioned, is based on adenovirus. So they use this adenovirus, which is a common cold virus, to get the COVID bits into the body to stimulate the immune system and develop.
It's carrying the COVID bits.
It's carrying the COVID bits.
It's
exactly.
A bit of transport. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's a transport. It's like the Trojan horse to get the COVID bits in to stimulate an immune response, but it's modified so it can't replicate. So you can't get the cold from the adenovirus either. Okay. It's actually a chimp adenovirus. So it's not one most of us will have seen. We won't already have antibodies against it. It's just a way of getting things in, but equally that's not going to cause problems either. And actually, vaccines based on adenovirus in the past for other infections have been studied, including in populations where HIV is very common, with no additional safety concerns.
We have Juddy Otti.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
Also, to give us some of the questions that she's had from the people that she works with. Now, Juddy, I know you were concerned because of the contents of the vaccines. Is there anything else you'd like to ask? You said that some of the people that you work with felt that they might not be allowed to take the vaccines because of their faith. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, Joe, thank you very much. I work with a particular number of people from the Muslim faith who are very concerned about the contents of the virus and whether their Muslim faith allows them to have this virus. You know, in particular, are there animal products?
So there are no animal products in either the Pfizer or the Oxford vaccines. including no egg, because some vaccines contain tiny amounts of egg protein, which means if you have a very severe allergy to egg, you shouldn't have them. Actually, the amounts of egg are very, very tiny and not a problem for most people with egg allergy, but there's no animal products at all in the vaccines.
Just to confirm, Laura, there are no pig products at all used in making the vaccines.
Correct, no pig products in the vaccines.
That's useful. Also, Judy, you were telling me that there had been, it's called vaccine hesitancy. In other words, people not wanting to use vaccines, particularly in Nigeria. Could you just give me the background to that?
Yes, Joe. And the background to this is previously there was polio vaccines done in many African countries. Nigeria in particular was, they had a bad experience with some of the polio vaccines. And in addition to that, a lot of word going round that the polio vaccine was, one of their aims was to sterilize the population, to reduce the population, to make people sterile. And these same fears are now being transferred to the COVID vaccine, and people are concerned that it is here to come and reduce population, to make people sterile or unable to have children. What's your comment on that?
Could I just say, I appreciate that these are things that people are genuinely concerned about. So could you be very clear, Laura, in explaining with your answer?
I mean, polio vaccine is very, very different to COVID vaccine. First of all, I'm certainly not aware that the polio vaccine was ever associated with infertility, for example. But some polio vaccines are live, so it's very different to the COVID vaccine. All I can say is there's no evidence at all that modern vaccines can affect people's fertility, and I genuinely am confident there is no agenda for population control or anything like that through the vaccine program. This is about protecting people from getting sick and dying from COVID-19. In terms of kind of females and fertility issues and the like, we don't know how well the vaccines are going to work in pregnant women yet. There are studies ongoing. As we know from HIV treatment trials, the early trials are often focused on adults who aren't too unwell, and then they get studied in broader groups like children and pregnant women or people with other illnesses. So it's important to get more data, but based on other vaccines, that there's no indication that these vaccines wouldn't be safe. A bit like people with HIV, we need to understand how well they work in pregnant women, because pregnancy itself can affect the immune system as well.
Yes, another thing that both Judy and yourself, Jose, were saying to me, so please either of you pick up on this, was what is the representation of different population groups in vaccine trials? So that's a bit bigger than just maybe the ones that we're talking about, but they're the ones that people are thinking about. Jose, you said you'd had quite a few comments on that.
Yeah, I think there's this experience of how many people that look like me have been in those trials, and how much can I trust the trial if there isn't people that look like me within the trial. So that's kind of been the rhetoric around it and the questioning around it. Yeah.
Judy, you said you'd had the same thing.
Yes, it's a very, very big concern as to how many people that from the Black community have had in the trials, or how many people living with HIV who are Black, African are in the trials, and that's a really big concern.
Laura, what would you say?
Yeah, no, so understandable concerns, of course, and it won't be a surprise to hear that if you look again at the Pfizer and the Oxford vaccines, most of the participants were white. So in the Pfizer vaccine study, more than 80% of people in the study were white. Although one good thing, a group that's often underrepresented thinking about HIV trials, is almost half the people in the studies were women. They were actually generally slightly older, so the average age was 52, And it was quite common, at least 1 in 5 people had another comorbidity, so another illness like heart disease or kidney disease. So it represented, I think, in that respect, a population fairly typical for people with HIV. But yes, underrepresentation of Black people and people from other ethnic groups, and obviously needing to understand the extremes of age better would be good. For the Oxford vaccine, it's a bit of a mixture. So the publication actually looks at 4 different studies of the Oxford vaccine, 2 from the UK, 1 from Africa, South Africa, and 1 from Brazil. So it's all a bit of a mixture. Again, a lot of the people in the trial came from the UK or from Brazil. And in the UK, very few people in the study were Black. In the Brazil study, it was about 1 in 10. And actually, they were looking at slightly younger people, so it was a younger population and generally fewer other illnesses. So the answer is people have been represented. 2 small numbers at the moment, really, but there are lots of ongoing studies. So there are studies looking at broader groups of people in different countries, and we'll get those answers. And again, for now, we have to look at vaccines in general. Is there any reason why someone who is Black would respond differently to someone who is white? And the answer is probably not. Actually, I found one study showing that amongst young people in America, African Americans responded better to flu vaccine than Caucasian Americans. Now, does that mean ethnicity makes a difference? Probably not, because it's going to depend on things like whether you've had the vaccine before, whether you've had the infection before. There are lots of things that might affect how one person responds to a vaccine compared to another. But I think the fact that the direction showed a stronger response is reassuring from that study at least. So it's unlikely there'll be any differences. Studying different groups of people is of course important, but I think we need to get the message out there that based on other vaccines, we're confident that the COVID vaccine is going to work for everybody, and even a partial response is a good thing.
You've just said a partial response. One of the things that's always puzzled me, because I don't exactly know how it works out, is we are being told that the Oxford vaccine is 70% effective and that the Pfizer is 90% effective. It does not take the brain of Britain to think, well, I'm going for the 90% one. You know, what does 70% effective actually mean? Does it mean 30% of us are still going to get COVID if we have the vaccine? Can you explain?
Yeah, so what it means, so you're right, the sort of overarchingly, the Oxford vaccine has been shown to be on average 70% effective, and the Pfizer one is coming in at 95%. Now, for both those results, that's based on symptomatic COVID-19. What that means is people had to have symptoms, or at least one symptom of COVID, so cough, fever, whatever that was, plus a positive COVID test. So what it means is the number of cases of COVID-19 in the Pfizer study, it was 95% lower for people who got the vaccine compared to people who didn't. And in the Oxford study, it was 70% lower. Now, actually, the total numbers of people who got COVID, during a short period of follow-up was actually relatively small. So it's a relative difference. It doesn't mean there's a 30% chance of getting COVID. It just means if you've got the vaccine, you've got a 70% lower chance compared to someone who hasn't. So there is that difference. But when it comes to vaccines, it's very important to think about a whole population rather than an individual's response. And actually, I'm no expert in kind of global vaccines, but the general consensus is it's better to get a less effective vaccine out to everybody than to get the most effective vaccine to just a few. And the problem with the Pfizer vaccine at the moment is it's more expensive and it needs to be frozen at quite a low temperature. So from a practical level, that's quite a hassle, whereas the Oxford vaccine is cheaper and you can stick it in a fridge for up to 6 months. So it's going to be easier to roll out. The other thing we don't know yet is how long the protection will last. So yes, you can look at the papers and say, well, the Pfizer one looks better, but what about 12 months time? Now, there's no suggestion that the Pfizer one will be less effective than Oxford in 12 months time. We don't know, but really the key thing is to get a vaccine, whether that's Oxford, whether that's Pfizer. some protection is better than none. You get some protection after just one dose of both of them, and there's a lot of debate going on at the moment about how long a gap there should be between the two. But really, people should get whichever vaccine they are offered, and then we learn more. And if people need boosting or the other type of vaccine the following year, we're going to find that with time. But for now, the priority is to get a vaccine into as many people as we can.
Somebody has been told that antiretrovirals interact with the vaccine. I don't know where that came from.
Who knows where it came from? The same place that many of these myths come from, but I can say with confidence it is a myth. So there's no interaction between the vaccine and HIV drugs. HIV drugs won't stop the vaccine working. The vaccine will not stop HIV drugs working. They are absolutely fine. There's no interaction at all.
Thanks ever so much. Thank you. Judy, I remember you saying to me, if you think you've had COVID, maybe you weren't tested, do you need to have the vaccine? Is that something that you've heard?
Yes, and for example, I myself got COVID. I got confirmed that I had COVID, and so the question is, do I still then need to get the vaccine? If then, when? But that's been a major question because a lot of people think they have or have confirmed COVID, and they then think maybe they don't need the vaccine now because they have antibodies.
But the advice at the moment is that people who have had suspected or confirmed COVID should still get the vaccination. The Department of Health are advising for people who've got very recent COVID or current COVID, they wait 4 to 6 weeks after then to get the vaccination, but people should still get the vaccination at the moment.
That's very important. And the new variant, this will be a final question, but the new variant, do the vaccines work against the thing that is infecting so many people all over the country at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing to point out, there have been lots of variants. So the type of virus that this particular coronavirus is, they mutate a lot. But then the word mutation is quite a sort of loaded term. Mm-hmm. And I actually read a piece earlier today that described it as typos. If you type out a very long document, you make a couple of typos. And the virus is a bit like that. Every time it reproduces, there's a few typos. We know the same with HIV. Is constantly evolving. So the word mutant or mutation can sound a bit frightening. This particular variant, the UK variant at the moment, is of interest because it's sort of suddenly become the sort of main variant, and there is some evidence that it may be easier to transmit that to other people. Varies, but probably round about 50% more likely to be passed on. It's very difficult to tease out the virus from people's behavior, but there is some evidence that perhaps the amount of virus is higher and there's something about it that makes it easier to pass on. The key thing is where it has got some typos or some mutations, that's not in the bits that would affect the vaccine. So at the moment, we're confident that the vaccines will work against the UK variant. But ultimately, these vaccines are effective, at least in the short term. They are safe, at least in the short term. Have they been carried out long enough? Are the studies big enough to spot rare side effects? No, not at the moment. But COVID, and particularly severe COVID, is no walk in the park. People get sick, people die, people are experiencing longer term symptoms. So everything we know about the vaccines at the moment is their benefits far outweigh any risks. So we absolutely should encourage the vaccines. I think one thing worth mentioning, and it might be worth mentioning here, are updated BHIVA and Terence Higgins Trust advice. So we've updated our vaccine advice, including the plain English version, because the information leaflets for the Pfizer vaccine specifically mention HIV under the list of warnings. So they say people with a weakened immune system, e.g. HIV, need to speak to their doctor or nurse or pharmacist before having the vaccine. The Oxford one doesn't mention HIV, but it does mention weakened immune systems. And while we've been recording this, the Moderna vaccine, which is a similar vaccine to the Pfizer one, has been approved for the UK. And the leaflet for that one also mentions immune deficiency. So the thing to emphasize to everybody, going back to our beginning about there is no reason to think these vaccines are not safe in people with HIV, that's what this is about. None of these warnings are about safety. They're just acknowledging that there's not much data yet in those people. But the best thing is to still have the vaccines. The vaccines are still recommended, and people with HIV are recommended to have a vaccine. In fact, are prioritized in the Department of Health kind of prioritization, that they should get the vaccine sooner than people of the same age who don't have HIV.
So basically, because there isn't a lot of information, those particular pharma companies are including HIV because they know it affects the immune system. And dare I say it, they're maybe not realizing that the vast majority of people with HIV have a pretty fine, strong immune system because of treatment.
No, absolutely. And it's only the Pfizer one that specifies
Yeah.
HIV, and actually the British HIV Association are challenging that we don't think it's justified to mention HIV specifically. But there are no safety concerns. This is about lack of data in how well the vaccines work, but that shouldn't stop people having a vaccine. We still recommend it.
Okay. And it's not just for you. And I know it's corny, but it is for your granny, but it is for everyone. My next door neighbor died from COVID, you know? I think if you actually know someone, you have a different feeling. And what I hope we've been able to do is answer at least some of the questions. Thank you for all you've contributed, and thank you if you're watching.